Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to the course code ENG 455, lecture number 28. As you know, this lecture series, currently we are talking about the history of linguistics, and we are discussing different linguists that established different theories with respect to linguistics and introduced certain ideas with respect to language. So with respect to this historical linguistics, we can say this is the end of this history about linguistics, and today our focus would be on the Prague School and the London School. So what we have done so far regarding the history of linguistics, as I told you, that this would be the fourth and the final lecture on the history of linguistics. So what we have discussed so far is that during the 19th century, before this linguistics, the study of language was popular. As we can see the different disciplines like philology were there, comparative philology was there, and traditional grammarians were there. The language study was already there, but what made the linguistic emerge as a different discipline from them was the more focus, and primarily focus only on language. Before them, the people, they were used to study language with respect to other disciplines, but with respect to these modern linguistics, the focus of attention was totally being considered as the language and language only. Ferdinand de Saussure was the first one in this regard who came up with the structuralist theory and considered as the pioneer of modern linguistics. He was the first one who introduced the idea of language as a complete system. Language, and according to him, language itself is a system, so no need to study things beyond it, and no need to study things here and there. Language itself is a complete, complicated type of system, and we need to focus our attention only on the study of language. Then he talked about language as a system of signs, where he introduced his famous theory of signs, linguistic sign, as comprised of signifier and signified, the concept plus the image. Then he introduced the idea of language as a system of differences, language not nomenclature, the idea of static and evolutionary linguistics. So many ideas were there which got popularity with respect to Saussure. Saussure, the book is The Course in General Linguistics, which was published after the death of Saussure by his students, and this book is basically composed of the series of lectures that were delivered by Saussure. So Saussure, with this Course in General Linguistics, is known as the founding father of modern linguistics. Again, the other linguists, they emerged. As over here, I should mention here, the structuralism is not only famous with the name of Saussure, though he is the founding father, but the other linguists like the Bloomfield, like Boas and Wolff and Sapir, they were also known as the structuralists, and rather they are known as American structuralists. So structuralism, it has great impacts on different areas of knowledge, like the literature, like the criticism and anthropology. It affected so many areas and disciplines of knowledge. So it was a revolutionary step. But then came the Chomsky, another famous linguist with respect to modern linguistics, came up with transformational generative grammar, or usually known as the generative linguistics idea. He criticized structuralism for his focus on language as a system of signs. And then he criticized that this structuralist talks about, by focusing on signs, they talk about morphological and phonological aspect of language, neglecting the syntax level. So Chomsky approach is more syntax based, more talking about the structure and of the syntax rather, and we can call it the syntactic structures. And he came up with the different ideas of grammar like phrase structure grammar, TGG, and so many other types of the ideas about the nature and of the syntax and the importance of syntax with respect to language. And after Chomsky, we moved to another famous school of thought, that was functionalism. Functionalism agreed to structuralism, Structuralism only focusing structure of language, functionalism focused functions of the language. They functions plus structures of the language, but for them language is something for performing activity. So it is the function which of the languages is more important than the structure of language. And with respect to structural functionalism, we have a well-known name of Halliday. Halliday, with his systemic functional linguistics, brought a revolutionary idea of language regarding the language analysis in the field of modern linguistics. The systemic functional linguistics, it talked about language and nature, the language as an activity of doing things, language as something to use to perform actions. And then his ideas of a choice, the meanings implies choice, and the choice they determine the structure. So the meanings are there at the top. What meanings you want to convey with the use of language, they are at the top level. Then according to that meanings you make choices, and finally you have structures as output. So these three levels, they are important for languaging. Then another important landmark of Halliday is of his meta functions of language. The three meta functions of language, the ideational, interpersonal and communicative, who helped to analyze the language with respect to functions it performs. Then the value of context with respect to functionalism, how context is at the top level of language, how the language is actually inside the context. The context determines language and use and structures, and everything is based on the context. And then finally with the three stratas of language, which help us to determine that meaning of a language is not only at one level, it is at three levels. It is at semantic level, it is at lexicogrammar level, and then it is at phonological graphology level. So that was another important idea by Halliday. These are the things that we have done so far with respect to this linguistics, that how the different schools they emerge, they propose their ideas with respect to some popular names in modern linguistics. So what's our focus today? Today's lecture is going to focus the Prague School and the London School, at the same time relational grammar. Actually, I'm not saying that okay, these are only the few school linguists who are there with respect to which we study in modern linguistics, or these are some of the schools of the thought, but these are some well-known schools of thought that we have discussed so far with respect to history of linguistics, like structuralism, functionalism, generativism, relational grammar, and the Prague School and the London School. You can say that these are the backbones of this linguistic study. They are the most famous schools of thought when you talk about linguistics. So that's why we have discussed only these one. Beyond that, you can find many other schools of thought, like in generative phonology is there, and lexical semantics is there. Especially nowadays, so many different areas and branches of grammar have been introduced that it's hard to encapsulate all of them. You cannot talk. There are hundreds of grammatical theories in the field of linguistics, which and everyone having certain drawbacks, at the same time having certain positive points. Some of them we have discussed in another lectures on our syntax. If you remember, we talked about tagmimics, and then we have talked about stratificational grammar and case grammar. That three were also, you can consider them as schools of linguistics, as a school of thought in linguistics. Case grammar, stratificational grammar, and tagmimics, they are the recent branches of linguistics. So you can also include them while talking about the history of linguistics, some recent approaches toward the linguistics. But because we have discussed them already, so I am going to focus only these three schools of thought today, that is the Prague School, the London School, and the relational grammar. With respect to Prague School, many names are there, but the most famous names are of Jacobson, Roman Jacobson, and Trubetskoy. In the London School, we have the names of Malinowski, Firth, and Halliday, whereas in the relational grammar, we have the name of Perlmutter and Postel. So these are some of the famous linguists who are associated with these schools, and we will focus on these linguists with respect to these schools of thought. So let's start with the Prague School. Prague School established 1926. Basically, you can say that the Prague School is also a type of, a different school of thought, a different school of linguistics, but the basic tenet is of that of, again, functionalism. So if I take the functionalism as a top category, then inside the functionalism we have different schools like the Prague School, and even the London School is also an offshoot of the functionalism. They all talk about the language functions rather than the language structures. So you can consider the Prague School as an offshoot of functionalism. Basically, this school was established by a group of literary critics and linguists in Prague. Prague in Czech Republic, it is the capital of Czech Republic, and basically the name is of Prague, but the people who were included in the school of thought were most of them belonged to Russia. From Russia they migrated to this Czech Republic, established in Prague, and the school and all those linguists who were there in Prague talking about language in one way or other way, they established their own school of linguistics known as the Prague School. The major proponents were the Nikolai Trubetskoy, Roman Jakobson, Sergei Karasvitsky. These are the major proponents. These are the people who actually talk about the different language aspects. And what was the focus of this Prague School? Number one, language in terms of function. As I told you, functionalism is the basic talent again behind this Prague School. They adopted functionalism, functionalism emerged as a school of thought. It was adopted by British linguists, and they established the London School. It was established, taken by the people, the linguists who were in Prague, and they established the Prague School. So basically all they belong to one school of thought, that is functionalism. And second important thing, they were at one side they were concerned with functionalism, but at the same time their more major concern was on phonology. Actually, you can say that the Prague School is the one who can be considered as the more active contributor in the field of phonology, because these people in the Prague School, majority of them were interested in sound system analysis, and phonology actually as a subject was established by the Prague School. Before that, the study of sound system was there, but that was under one label, that was phonetics. Phonology was actually merged inside the field of phonetics. But later on with this Prague School, they identified phonology as something different from phonetics, and then they introduced phonology as an offshoot of phonetics. So with respect to functionalism as well as with respect to phonology, this school of thought, that is the Prague School, has a major contribution. Now, what are some of the major ideas of this Prague School? Because I am talking about all the Prague School, so I'm talking about all the individual ideas by Trubetskoy and by Jakobson, whatever the major prominent ideas that were developed by a Prague School. Instead of focusing only one person, I'm focusing the whole school. And what were the major contributions that were made by the Prague School? Number one, the Prague School developed distinctive feature analysis of sounds. Each distinctive sound in language is composed of a number of contrasting articulatory and acoustic features. If you can say, as I mentioned, that the focus of Prague School was too much on the sounds analysis. So this distinctive feature analysis is actually the landmark of the Prague School. Distinctive feature analysis, if you go into the details of phonology, you will see distinctive feature analysis as an area of study in phonology. In phonology, the distinctive feature analysis, it helps you to analyze, for example, choose a language and analyze each and every sound in that language and identify the distinct features of that sound. If you remember, with respect to articulatory phonetics, and I introduced you with the table of consonants, and the table of consonants, the consonants, they were divided into categories of according to manner of articulation and places of articulation. So that was somehow showing the distinctive features. For example, the sound ba. Now if I want, this is a sound ba in English language, if I want to create the distinctive feature analysis, then according to distinctive feature analysis, this is the sound ba in English language. Ba is according to places of articulation, it is a bilabial sound produced with the help of two lips. So this is the one feature, bilabial. Number two, ba, this is somehow the plosive sound, because when I say ba, a puff of air is with it. So again, another feature of this sound is it is plosive. So this way, then I can further divide it, that whether it is affricate or sonorants, or if whatever the features that I will associate with this single language, this analysis method is known as distinctive feature analysis. And you know, for every language, this distinctive feature analysis is very important to conduct, because with the help of distinctive feature analysis, we can have a detailed study of that. For example, we can have a distinctive feature analysis of Urdu language, that okay, what are the sounds in there in English language, what are the features, specific features of every single sound that is there in Urdu language. So this distinctive feature analysis of sounds, it is very important, because it distinguishes sounds in a language. For example, it tells that what are the characteristics of ba sound, how it is different from pa sound. Pa is again a bilabial, but there is another factor, there are certain other features which distinguish pa sound from ba sound. So the distinctive feature analysis is a distinguishing characteristics that to show that what sounds are there in a language, and what are what it is composed of, what are the features that make one sound in a language. Then what are the features that make the second sound in language, what are the features that make the third sound in language. So and again, all the sounds in one language, and then what are the things that are there in individual sounds. So in this regard, distinctive feature analysis is actually a landmark by the Prague School. Then the Trubetskoy name. Trubetskoy, the pioneer of phonology, who separated phonology from phonetics and established phonology as a different discipline from phonetics. Yes, this was Trubetskoy, who studied phonology, different features of sound, and with respect to not only human sound, but with respect to different languages. And then he came up with the idea that okay, we should separate from phonology from phonetics. Phonetics is all about human sound, all the sound that human beings can produce, regardless of any particular language. But phonology, on the other hand, is the set of sound that are linked or associated with a particular language. For example, 44 sounds are there in English language. There are certain number of languages in Urdu language. There are certain number of sounds in Arabic language. So this way we have number of sounds in any particular language. And when we study sounds with respect to particular languages, that is phonology, different from phonetics. So this way, the phonology as a different discipline was established by the Prague School. Then we have another contribution, because the Trubetskoy, he was very much interested in the study of phonology. Then he was the first one who introduced phoneme. Phoneme as the smallest distinctive unit of any language sound. So Trubetskoy, this idea of phoneme, again, the major contributions in phonology were made by the Prague School. They established phonology as a different discipline. They established the idea of distinctive feature analysis. They introduced the concept of phoneme. Before them, there was no concept of phoneme. They introduced this idea that, okay, if we divide a language with respect to sounds, then the smallest distinctive unit that we can get is phoneme, and that was defined by Trubetskoy. Then Trubetskoy, another contribution he made with respect to morphophonology. Morpheme, phonemes, the study of their connection is known as morphophonology. According to Trubetskoy, actually the smallest sounds unit are phonemes, and these phonemes, they are together make morphemes. So morphemes is the smallest unit at morphological level, phoneme is the smallest unit at phonological level, and they are interrelated, and together we can have a study like morphophonology, where we can talk about that how the morphemes, they are created with the help of phonemes, how phonemes, they are settled together to make morpheme. So this was again an idea by Trubetskoy. Then Jacobson, another important member in the Prague school, Roman Jacobson, he also in beginning more was concerned about phonology. He considered that phonology is an independent discipline. Again, the Prague school played its important role in establishing phonology as a different discipline from phonetics. Okay, the Trubetskoy has already introduced this idea that phonology is an offshoot of phonetics, something different from phonetics, but still he regarded it as an offshoot of phonetics. Whereas the Jacobson, he considered it as a total different discipline from phonetics. So totally the idea of this way that the discipline of phonology was introduced by the Prague school. Then another contribution by this Prague school was, and especially with reference to Jacobson, they stress the function of elements with language within the language, the contrast of language elements to one another, and the total pattern or system formed by these contrasts, thus develop techniques for analysis of language system. According to them, the language system, we need to develop certain techniques to analyze it. And how we can analyze language systems? By taking language and then by identifying its different elements, and then by contrasting those elements. So by this way we can analyze language. Then Jacobson, he presented some ideas regarding first language acquisition. There also, Jacobson, he actually developed some sort of theory to explain how this first language acquisition is carried on in children, that how the little children, the infant, they acquire language with such an ease, and how this thing happens. And his first language acquisition theory is more concerned, more focused on the sounds thing, that how the children, they pick sound, they gather sound, they make words, and these things are there in his first language acquisition theory. And another contribution by Jacobson, which are known as communicative functions of language. As I mentioned, the Prague school is actually following the school of thought that is functionalism. So this is the Jacobson, he introduced the communicative functions of language, which are quite popular. Still now, Halliday, you can say that Halliday, he based some of his ideas of functions of language on the ideas of Jacobson. So what are these functions of language? According to Jacobson, language performs communicative functions. As you know, language is a device for communication. So when we communicate, then we can divide the way we communicate according to our communication needs. We have different categories. For different type of communication, language has different functions. So he introduced certain categories. Like the first one, he introduced the referential communicative function of language. Now what is meant by referential? Referential means that language performs the functions of referencing. Now what does it reference? It references a situation or an object or a mental state. It provides a reference towards something. Then and how it provides the reference towards something? That it describes that it describes a certain situation, or it describes an object, or it describes a mental state. So providing a reference towards a certain function of language, that is a referential function. For example, the autumn leaves have fallen. What it is communicating? It is providing a reference to the situation. The situation is that the autumn leaves have fallen, or another reference to the season of autumn. that okay, the autumn season has arrived, so the leaves they have fallen. So again it is referencing towards certain situation. Then according to Jacobson, there is an expressive function, communicative function. Expressive, when you express yourself, when you express your feelings, when you express your meaning, when you express your desires. For example, by using interjections, you express yourself. Now what expression is there? The feeling of pain. Hurrah! What feeling is there? The expression of happiness. So you express your feelings, emotions with the help of certain interjections. So such use of language, because it is expressing the speaker's internal state, so they perform the expressive communicative function. Wow, what a wonderful view. Now the expressing my internal feelings, that I am very happy to see something. Wow, what a wonderful picture you have drawn, praising something. Hurrah, we have won the match, the most common example that is given. Alas, we have lost the match. So again, with the help of certain interjections, we do not only communicate certain ideas, but at the same time, we communicate our internal feelings. So this is another communicative function that can be performed by language. Then we have the conative function. Now conative function engages the addressee directly, mean in which when I'm speaking something, when I'm communicating to a certain person, I am engaging the other person within the talk. I am involving him in this. Mean I'm just not expressing something, I'm just not telling something, or not just describing something. Rather, I am dragging him inside the communication. Come inside and finish your work. Now, I just not only saying certain thing, rather I want him to perform this activity. You can call it some type of speech acts, where you want the listeners to do something. And usually we make use of vocatives, imperatives. That is, can you give me a glass of water? No, this is not an expression. This is not a statement. I actually want you to give me a glass of water. So this is actually conative function. Please shut the door. Now shut the door. I am not asking the listener. I'm not making any statement to the listener. I'm not just telling him something. I'm asking him to do something. Again, some sort of speech acts. This which was later on named by speech acts by the pragmatics. In pragmatics by different people, but with Jacobson, he named these such communicative actions as conative communicative function. That language performs a communicative function of conative when you involve the addressee inside the conversation, inside the communication. You want him to do something, or to carry out something, or to say something even. Not a physical activity always. Maybe you want to, how are you feeling today? So I am not asking him, I am not making a statement. I want you to reply me that how he is feeling today. So this way, these are the conative communicative function. Then we have the poetic communicative function. You know, the way the language is used in the poetry and slangs. They make the use of poetic devices, the rhyming schemes, or certain specific words to communicate a certain message. And usually this kind of messages you will find in poetry, or in slangs, or in slogans, or in even the advertisement. They make use of this poetic use of language. They use certain specific pattern of communication to convey their message, to convey their meaning. Like L'Oreal, because you're worth it. Now this is a slogan by a famous beauty products, L'Oreal. So they if you look at the structure of the sentence, they are conveying actually certain message, because you're worth it. Just like if I give you an example, very common example as I see it nowadays on television, Habib Banaspati, kyunki dil ka मामला है. Now this kyunki dil ka मामला है, it is actually conveying certain message. It is not just conveying you simple statement or simple idea. They are giving you certain deep messages that this is something that is concerned with the health of your heart. So these certain communicative functions are categorized by Jacobson as poetic functions. Then we have fatigue. Now, what is fatigue? Fatigue is actually language for the sake of interaction. Fatigue is just like chit chat. No purpose of communication. I do not want to convey a message. Just in routine chit chat, I see a person, I start talking to him just to get an introduction. Or my friend is sitting beside me, so just to pass the time watching TV, having a chit chat with him. Such type of communication is known as fatigue communication, because in most of the time the purpose of this communication is just the interaction, to interact with other people or to greet some people or general chit chat. No specific purpose is behind this type of communication. For example, hello, how are you? So what is my purpose? To greet you, to ask you, to interact with you, to establish interaction between you and me. So this type of communication is known as the fatigue communication. And then we have the metalingual, when we use language to talk about language, like I'm doing now. I'm using language to tell you about language. This is the metalingual function. For example, I say language is such a complex phenomenon. Now, I am using language to talk about the language, to express my feelings about language, to talk about certain things, to describe language. So this is metalingual function of language. So these are some of the important functions of language, communicative functions of language, which were described by Jacobson. Over here, the Prague school, we have, instead of going into details, I have just highlighted some major areas in the Prague school, the major proponents, their major contributions, and this language communication theory, which is very much popular. So we have discussed what this Prague school was all about. Now next we will start with the London school. The London school, the originator is John R. Firth, a British linguist. Actually, he was a British linguist already there, and when there were other linguists there in British environment, like Halliday was there, Malinowski there, so all of them, they are talking about different things, but because they all were in British land, so they together established a school known as the London School of Linguistics. And the major contributors to the London School, or the major proponents of the London School, are John R. Firth, Malinowski, and this Halliday. They all belongs to the British environment, so their school of thought is known as the London School. Again, the London School, it talks about, the people inside them, maybe they are talking about one thing or two things, but they together they are London School. But the perspective is that again they take language as a functional device, and they talk about the nature of language in the same way. So let's talk about some of John R. Firth. Firth was influenced by an anthropologist, Malinowski. So you can say Malinowski was already there. Firth was inspired by his theory, and in turn he influenced his student, the well-known linguist Mac Halliday. So all the linguists in the Halliday, in the London School, they are actually they are the student of each other. Malinowski was the teacher, Firth was his student, Firth was the teacher, and Halliday was his student. So all these student-teacher generation, they together established this school. The three men all stress the importance of context of situation and the system aspect of language. These two are the major highlighted areas in their theories regarding language. This London School is also known as systemic linguistics and functional linguistics. As you know, the systemic linguistics as proposed by Halliday, and the functional linguistics, because all of these three linguists, they talk about the functional approach of language. So somehow you can relate this London School with functionalism, with functional linguistics. So as you know, the Malinowski, he was the teacher of Firth. So let's start from Malinowski theories about language. According to Malinowski, language is a mode of action rather than as a counterpart of thought. If you know that when we say that language, okay, it is an expression of thought, but according to Malinowski, it is not just only an expression of thought. It is a source of action as well. If you remember the speech acts, you do not only use to express ourselves, we do not use a language to express our feelings, we do not use language only to express what we are thinking. At the same time, we use language to perform several functions. It is a mode of action. And according to him, the meanings of an utterance does not come from the ideas of the words comprising it, but from its relation to the situational context in which the utterances occur. Again, very famous idea that we have discussed again and again, the role of context in language. Halliday talked about it, Malinowski talked about it, speech act theory talked about it, and even the Chomsky, to some extent he talked about it, not very much. He was actually more concerned with language rather than the context. But majority of the linguists of the modern age, they talked about the value of context in relation to language, because it is not always the words inside my language, words inside my utterances that give you my meaning. Sometimes it is the context that gives you my meaning. If you remember with respect to pragmatics, somehow the pragmatic nature of language. If you remember, the pragmatics is the study of intended meanings of speaker. Okay, pupils are crossing. Stop, pupils are crossing. Now what pupils? Now if I look at the word meaning of that word pupil, I know the word pupil has two meanings. The pupil of my eye and the pupil in the school, the students. Now what meaning is there? The pupils are crossing. So stop, pupils are crossing. Do you think the eyes ball, they are crossing the road? No. What is the context? The context is sometime maybe of school or some important flaws where children are crossing the road, where the students are crossing the road. So the meaning is in relation to the context. It is mostly the context of the language which determines meaning rather than the words inside the utterances. Again, the pragmatic nature of language. That language, the meanings, we have to understand the meaning. Okay, he is building castles in the air. Does he actually doing this? Do you think is he actually building castles in the air? No, pragmatic, because I'm using metaphorical nature of language, that this is a metaphor. Building castles in the air refers to a person who does not do anything actually, but he just keeps on dreaming. So this way, the language, the meanings of the language, they are not, you do not derive them from the actual words, rather you derive them from the context. So this way, this Malinowski, he was very much concerned with importance of context in conveying meanings of language. Then further, Malinowski believed that utterances and situations are bound up inextricably with each other, and the context of situation is indispensable for the understanding of the word. Means you cannot separate context from the words. The words are always there with the context. Sometimes if it happens to you as well, that sometimes it happens to me that that I do not know the meaning of the word, but by reading the text, by reading the sentence or the 2-3 sentences together, I derive the meaning of that word. So this is contextual, because the context is very important in giving a meaning to a word. And for Malinowski, this context is an indispensable part of the meaning of the word. So what is there in the word? Not only the meaning, but also the context. The meaning of the word would be conveyed with the help of context. So this way, Malinowski, his theories, they were more focused on the relationship of context and language, or you can say on the pragmatic nature of language and the value of context in language. And finally, he distinguished 3 types of context situations. As I told you, that because he was of his interest in determining the context of language, he further determined that there can be the 3 types of context situations. Situations in which speech interrelates with bodily activity. For example, I am using my body, I am using my hands to convey the meanings, to convey. So look at the movement of my hands. This is the situation. This is the context. Is my body that I'm using, conveying my speech with the help of my body gestures. Then narrative situation. Then when the text is in written form, and then by narration, you can get that piece of text determines the context of that language. And finally, the situation in which speech is used to fill a speech vacuum. Aphatic communication, if you remember by Jacobson, that the purpose of the communication is to just have an interaction with you. There is no deep purpose behind that interaction. No deep purposes behind that communication. So these three types of contexts can accompany a language. Mean the getting the meanings of the language within the context of the text. What is the context of the text? About what this text has been written. What is the era in which that has been produced? What are the intentions of the writers that were reflecting over here? They all make the context of the text. Then the actual situational context where we use language to communicate, and finally where we just use language to fill the gap, just to have a chit chat. So these three types of contexts are established by Malinowski. Now Malinowski's theories about the importance of context with respect to language inspired his student Firth. So Firth theories are somehow the extensions of Malinowski theories. Let's talk about what were the first theories with respect to the London School. Now, first major contribution to linguistics, number one, Firth started the branch called linguistic semantics. Inspired by his teacher, talking about the value of meanings of language with relation to context, the Firth came up with the idea of linguistic semantics. He put forward the ideas that in analyzing a typical context of situation, one has to take into consideration both the situational context and the linguistic context of the text. Especially with respect to analysis, discourse analysis, this theory is important, because it does not only take into account that how the text can be understood, but also how the text can be analyzed. And when you are supposed to analyze a text, you need to take into account two types of context, the situational and linguistic. If you remember, we have done this with respect to pragmatics already, discourse analysis, that when you are performing the discourse analysis, you take into account two types of context, the linguistic and the situational context. Now, what is the linguistic context? Number one, the internal relations of the text itself. What are the internal relations of text itself? We can further divide them into two categories. Like look at the AB, 1AB. A, the syntagmatic relations between the elements in the structure. That what words are used there and what are the relationship of these words. And secondly, the paradigmatic relations between units in the system. For example, if this is a word, this word belongs to what category? Noun. This is an adjective. This is a verb. So these two types of analysis, they help you to determine the linguistic context of text. Whereas to determine the situational context, where we have the internal relations of the context of situation. For example, the relation between text and non-linguistic element and the general effects. And secondly, like the analytical relationships between words, parts of words, phrases, and the spatial elements of the context of situation. For example, the choice of words according to the meanings I want to convey. For example, I want to talk about a road accident that I witnessed, a horrible road accident. So my choice of words would be context dependent. I will be using the words like horrible, extremely dangerous, injured, heavily injured. So my words are again based on the context. So this again, as I told you, Firth, as a student of Malinowski, again promoted his ideas. Malinowski established the importance of context in determining the meanings in language. Firth promoted his theory and talked about two types of context to get meanings out of a text. Now, Firth also listed a model in his papers in linguistics that he presented in 1957 that covers both the situational context and the linguistic context of the task. Number one, the relevant features of the participants, persons, personalities, like the verbal action of the participants and the non-verbal action of the participant. Like I'm communicating, whether or not I'm using my bodily gestures, what kind of non-linguistic elements are accompanying the linguistic component. Number two, the relevant topics. What is the topic? Including objects, events, and non-linguistic, non-human events. And thirdly, the effects of verbal action. For example, if the communication, whether it is establishing some sort of verbal action. So these types of context, they help you to analyze text. First, second important contribution to linguistics is method of prosodic analysis called prosodic phonology. First, he talked about context, promoted just the Malinowski theory to talk more about the linguistic and situational context of the text. Second major contribution of Firth was his prosodic analysis. What is prosodic? The prosodic features of the language are the non-linguistic elements accompanying language, like stress, intonation, rhythm, the rhyme. These are the prosodic features of language. And when we analyze language, we can not only analyze the linguistic item, at the same time we can analyze the prosodic features. These prosodic analysis was actually the idea of Firth, where we analyze the stress pattern of language, the rhyme pattern of language, the rhythm pattern, the intonation pattern. All these are focused with respect to prosodic analysis. Then we have another, that Firth did not define prosodic unit. Actually this was a bit drawback with his prosodic analysis. He introduced the idea of prosodic analysis, but the drawback was that he didn't define what actually prosodic units are. However, his discussion indicates that prosodic units include such features as stress, length, nasalization, palatalization, and aspiration. And further on, nowadays the prosodic features do include the intonations and the other patterns related to features related to language. So that was about the Firth, major contributor in the London School. Next, another big name in the London School, Halliday. We have discussed Halliday in our just previous lecture. So again, why Mac Halliday is known for? Is known for his systemic functional linguistics. And his ideas of SFL, actually these ideas, they stem from the Firth theories. So as I told you that Firth was the teacher and Halliday was the student of Firth. So Halliday was inspired by Firth theories, and that's why his approach, his systemic functional linguistic, is sociologically oriented functional linguistic approach, and one of the most influential linguistic theories in 20th century. Once again, this theory is very much used to analyze language in with respect to especially meta function. So if you want to more details about Halliday, you should refer back to my previous lecture, that is number 27, on functionalism with respect to Halliday. So that was all about London School, the major contributors of the London School and their contribution. Now another modern school of analysis in his linguistics is relational grammar. Relational grammar, the basic, the proponent of this relational grammar was David Perlmutter. David Perlmutter and his that is Paul Postel. These two people, they around 1970s and 80s, they introduced the idea of relational grammar, and their idea was basically a criticism on Chomsky's transformational generative grammar. So you can say that they presented their ideas as an alternative to TGG, transformational generative grammar, and Blake, according to Blake, he identified this fact that relational grammar represents a reaction to early transformational grammar. It is not a single level theory, but a multiple one in which the initial stratum is analogous to deep structure and evolutions to transformations. The principal difference between the TG, that is transformational grammar, and RG, that is relational grammar. That relational grammar conceives of a sentence in terms of labeled relations bound to a predicate. That in TGG, if you remember with Chomsky TGG, we just had that sentence divided into noun phrase, verb phrases, and then verb phrases into further division of these phrases. But in relational grammar, the predicate part, especially the predicate part, more than the subject part, it is labelized in terms of the relations it bears. According to the relations, the predicate part is labeled. So we will discuss it in detail. Let's see, first explain how the relational grammar is in contrast to transformational grammar. For Chomsky, there were derived notions. For example, subject was defined as a noun phrase, directly dominated in phrase structure tree by a sentence. If I in phrase structure grammar and transformational generative grammar, if I draw a tree diagram for a sentence, at the top I would be having S, and then it's S divided into two parts, that is the noun phrase and the verb phrase. The subject part as noun phrase and the verb phrase as the predicate as verb phrase. And because all of these things are about the subject, so the noun phrase part is the leading part. That was with Chomsky. And this way he divided the sentences, and then yes, definitely these phrases into different parts further. But in relational grammar, they were taken as primitive. For example, in construction of Bill visited Mary. Now, Bill visited Mary, Bill and Mary are terms. They won't say, okay, Bill is the noun phrase, Bill is the noun phrase subject, visited Mary is the verb phrase. Instead of them, they would talk about the relationship between Bill and Mary. That Bill and Mary are two terms which bear distinct term relations. What is the relation? Subject-object relationship to the verb, and they both have a relationship with the verb visited. Subject visited something, so Bill has a relationship with the verbs visited. It has a relation. And who was visited? Mary. So Mary has also a relationship with the word visited. Both of the subject and object, they have a direct relationship with the verb. So in order to define to have the analysis of such structures, you need to define the relationships. You need to define the structure with respect to relationship. Now if I use the passive sentence, Mary was visited by Bill. Now Mary was visited by Bill. Again, what has happened, that Mary, which was previously an object, it has been moved to the place of subject, and when it has been moved, it is getting a promotion from object place to subject place. Whereas the Bill is getting a demotion because it is moved from subject place to object place. And again, the verb it has been accompanied now with an auxiliary to establish this relationship. So this way we can talk about sentences in terms of their relationships. The central idea of relational grammar is that there is a limited number of grammatical relations. The Perlmutter talks about only the limited number. What are the limited number of relationships? In a sentence, we can have a subject. We can have a direct object, as represented by DO. We can have an indirect object, IO, and then we can, these are some of the places. We can have subject, we can have direct object, and we can have indirect object. And all these three levels, they have a relationship with one verb. And at the same time, one term can bear more than one such relations at different levels of strata of the structure. For example, in the previous sentence, Bill visited Mary. Now Bill was at subject, but in the passive form of the same sentence, Mary was visited by Bill. The Bill is moved from subject to object place. So it means the Bill, who was actually the subject of the talk, he is demoted to another place. So again, the subject is getting another place. So subject is getting, the relationship of subject with the verb is changed. Similarly, the object, which was previously object, direct object, Mary, is promoted to subject place, so its relationship with the verb gets changed. So this way we can talk about the sentences or the language in terms of the relationships they bear. It is basically, again, because, talk about the syntactic analysis or syntactic theory, and it can be considered as an offshoot of descriptive grammar, in which syntactic operations like the subject-object rather than syntactic structures are used to define grammatical process. Chomsky talks about the grammatical syntactic structures, like he used the terms like noun phrase, verb phrase, and a prepositional phrase, whereas the relational grammar uses the syntactic operations to label the relationships, like subject and object and this. So their more concern is on the operations rather than the structures. Further, the relational grammar, it argues that primitive grammatical relations provide the ideal means to state syntactic rules in universal terms. Now, what is the primitive grammatical relationship? The simplest form of the sentence that Chomsky called as deep structure, the basic structure for a sentence. Put another way, relational grammar conceives of clauses as network of grammatical relations. As I told you, it talks about the relation. For example, in a clause we can have a relationship of that a clause is a predicate makes up a clause. In that clause we have a subject and a direct object, and the relationships are the properties that are relationships. They are recognized according to the properties they display. If a thing is at subject place, so the relationship with the verb would be of subject. If a thing is at object place, so the relationship with the verb is of object, or direct or indirect, depends upon their relationship nature with the verb. But over here, the crucial assumption of relational grammar is of strata. As you know, in the beginning I mentioned that relational grammar, it talks about the different levels. The same levels which talks about Chomsky. Chomsky called them deep structures and surface structures. Surface structures are actually the transformations of after deep structure. Similarly, this relational grammar also talks about different strata. That on the top we have a strata where we have the deep structure, the simplest form of sentence. And all other transformation like negative form, passive form, or interrogative form, any other form, it are the different strata of that. It is on different level from that basic strata. So the surface structure, they are on the different levels. This is the notion of strata in relational grammar. Let's talk about this. The description of a clause refers not only to its superficial structure but also to a deeper structure, and possibly to several intermediate levels of structure. In RG, these levels are called strata. As I mentioned, that the deep structure is the basic structure, but all the transformation forms, they are the different structure. The relational grammar position is that there is no one stratum at which all the properties associated with subject or object hold. Rather, these are apportioned at different strata. Relation in the initial stratum, the first one stratum, where we have a deep structure of sentence. They are linked to semantic roles, like agent, patient, like these things. Whereas relations in the final stratum determine more superficial phenomena like agreement and word order. These things should be there in different surface in the structures where there are surface level structures, the transformed forms of the basic structure. More about relational grammar, that the active sentence. Now look at the example. The committee recommended us. What is the committee role? Subject. What are us? Object, direct object. So at the first level of single stratum, the committee, subject, object is us. So it is an us, which is a pronoun. So this is the first level, the first level, first stratum, simplest one. Now if I change it into a passive form, we were recommended by the committee. Now what has happened? The committee, which was at a subject place, it has been moved to object place. The us, which were at object place, we are moved to the subject place. So we are given, us is given promotion, whereas the committee is given demotion. And whatever the things which are given demotion, with respect to relational grammar, they call them commure. Commure is a French word which means unemployed. So they call it, whenever a thing gets demotion, they call it commure. I will explain it with the help of these pictures. Look at these pictures. In these pictures you can clearly see the first one is the committee recommended us. First level, this stratum shows that this is the first level. 1 is showing the subject, 2 is showing the object, and P is showing the predicate, mean the verb. Look at the other part over here, the passive form. We were recommended by us. Now what has happened? Now the first level is actually the change, places are changed. Now what has happened? The 2 1 1 2 places has been changed into 2 1. Now according to relational grammar, when this demotion happens, that 1 2 is changed into 2 1. Now 1 remain 1, the 2 number 2 which gets the promotion, which is promoted from object to subject place, when it will come at subject place, it would be referred as 1 again. But the thing which has been demoted from object place to subject place to object place, it would be known as commere. So look at the second figure, it is represented as CHO, that is a commere, and verb stays at its place, P at its part. So this way we can have a relational grammar analysis of sentences. The first level is a deep, simple structure, and all other levels are about the different transformed structures. So this way we can represent sentences with respect to relational grammar. Now with this idea of relational grammar, another unique principle was introduced, that is known as Stratter's uniqueness law. Let's see what is this. The demotion of the initial subject to the commere. As I told you, whenever a subject is demoted to object place, it is known as commere. So when a subject is demoted as commere place, in passive clauses reflects a universal principle. The Stratter's uniqueness law, which stipulates that a stratum may contain at most one subject, one direct object, and one indirect object. This law prevents the initial stratum of subject in passive form persisting as subject when the direct object advances to subject. As you know, that usually we move the direct object to subject place rather than the indirect object. We played tennis in the morning. We subject, played verb, tennis direct object, in the morning indirect object. Morning is indirect object. So when I will make passive, I won't say morning was played by us in the tennis. No, rather I will only and only move the direct object, that is tennis. Tennis was played by us in the morning. So this Stratter's uniqueness law, it tells us that when we shift their places, subject object places or commere places, this is only the direct object which can be promoted to subject place rather than the indirect object. If you read the below part, there is an example given. Every student gave the teacher a present. Now every student subject, teacher is the direct object, whereas the present is indirect object. As direct object, it may advance. Now the teacher is direct object, so when we change it into passive form, we can say the teacher was given the teacher was given a present by every student. So the Stratter's uniqueness law prevents the initial direct object from persisting as such when the indirect object advances to direct object. This explains why it cannot passivize. Like we cannot say a present was given the teacher by every student. This is the wrong one. So this way the relational grammar, it explains the rules for passivization, that what are the objects or subjects which can be moved. So again, relational grammar strata according to Sampson. In relational grammar, there are 4 strata of language manifestation: form, content, form, expression, substance, content, and substance, expression. First 2 form, second 2 on substance, and on both things we have content, expression. The language consists of external relationships between elements of different strata and internal relationship between elements in one strata. That is what language is all about according to relational grammar. But now finally, relational grammar, what it's good for. Relational grammar played an important role in evolution of syntactic theory from 1970s to 80s. As I told you, that this relational grammar was established, was actually adopted as an analytic theory, was a good analytic theory. Then a number of ideas pioneered by relational grammar were incorporated into other theories, and with the help of this relational grammar, the other theories like lexical functional grammar, another approach towards the study of language, was introduced. So that's why the relational grammar, it has certain values. So to recap what we have done, and this is also the recap of all the historical linguistics that we are done with the history of linguistics, mean with respect to important schools of thought, with respect to important linguists that they who made contribution in the discipline of linguistics. We talk about structuralism, we talked about generativism, we talked about functionalism, and today we talked about three major schools, that is the Prague School, the London School, and the relational grammar. The Prague School mean proponent Jacobson and Trubetskoy, who actively contributed in the field of phonology, especially, as well as toward this functional approach towards language. Then the London School, totally functionalist, and in that regard we studied the theories by Milanowski and Firth, and actually we are already done with Halliday's theory with respect to the London School. And then finally we talked about a new theory, that is relational grammar, that talks about language in terms of the relations. Mean when you perform a syntactic analysis, you are interested in the relationships that the items in the language bear, rather than their position, structural positions inside the language. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that there are certain more modern theories that we have already done in our lecture series on syntax, that was stegmatics, case grammar, and stratificational grammar. These are all the different approaches in linguistics from beginning of linguistics till now. So that was all about the history of linguistics. See you in next lecture with a new topic. Till then, Allah Hafiz.